All right. As I was saying when I was cut off, there are points in the asthenosphere that happen to be hotter than others. And if you imagine a plate, just a huge slab of crust moving over a hot spot, the effect is kind of like what you would get if you held up a lit cigarette lighter and moved a piece of paper over the flame. Uh, I mean, it's possible the whole thing would catch on fire, but if you manage not to do that, you'd get a trail of scorch marks on the paper as it moved smoothly over the flame. The same thing happens as a continent moves over a hot spot. What you get is a chain of volcanoes, but the chain is parallel, not perpendicular to the direction that the continent is moving. A true island arc is perpendicular to the direction the plate's moving. A hotspot chain is parallel to it, and at any given time, the newest volcanoes are right on top of the hotspot, but older volcanoes have moved farther away, like objects on a conveyor belt. And the best example of this I've ever heard of is Hawaii. There's a hot spot deep underneath the Pacific plate, and that hot spot is pumping a lot of heat, melting a lot of rock, and driving volcanic activity on the big island of Hawaii. It's confusing. We use Hawaii as the name of the state, but Hawaii is also the name of the largest island in the state. And to avoid confusion, everybody calls it the Big Island. So we've got active volcanoes on the Big Island. The volcano Kilauea has been erupting pretty steadily since, think about 1981. It's actually added a couple of acres to the island because there have been these lava flows that have reached the sea and hardened into solid rock. So the island's actually grown a little bit. Now, Hawaii is right on top of the hotspot. The island to the west, Maui, has not erupted since I think the last eruption was 1783. The island to the west of that, Oahu, has not erupted for several 100,000 years, if memory serves. That's where Honolulu is, by the way, the capital city. That's where Pearl Harbor is. And then the oldest of the major Hawaiian islands, Kauai, has not had significant eruptions for about 6 million years, I think. So instead of, if this were an island arc, all of the islands would be roughly the same age and they'd all be more or less equally volcanically active. On a hotspot chain, the islands form in a time order from oldest to youngest. The youngest are still forming. Hawaii, the big island, is still growing, and the islands get older as you move away from the hotspot because the plate is acting like a conveyor belt moving on top of that hotspot, carrying older islands farther away. And in fact, the Hawaiian chain is a whole lot longer than the islands in the state of Hawaii. The state of Hawaii is basically that, but there's a whole chain of tiny islands, and some of them aren't even above the surface, little reefs and pinnacles coming out here all the way to Midway Island. And then we think there must have been a change in direction of the plate because that chain of undersea pinnacles goes all the way up here. So halfway across the Pacific, all the way to Alaska was where that chain goes. So we have, the big island is right there. These are variously called the Leeward Islands. These include Laysan and Nihoa and the French Frigate Shoals and the Gardner Pinnacles, all the way up to Midway, which was the site of a famous naval battle in the Second World War, and going all the way up to the Emperor Seamounts, which are completely completely submerged. They would have been islands once, but they have eroded below the surface of the ocean. They were discovered, by the way, by a Japanese research team in about 1900 and named for the Emperor of Japan, I might add. So all this time, there's been this hotspot, and the plate has been moving over the hotspot, generating this chain of islands, with the newest forming right here, right on top of the hotspot, and the islands getting progressively older and older as you move away from the hotspot. And we think because of the plate changing direction is why we have this dog leg. Actually, people do argue a little about that, but uh, that's not something I'm qualified to get into. So if we look at the dates here, the Big Island began forming 700,000 years ago, and it's still forming now. These four islands, we think, used to be part of a single large island called Maui Nui, that is now sunk a little bit, and so we have separate islands now. But you can see that Maui Nui, this part of it formed about 1.8 million years ago, Kahoolawe about a million, Maui from 1.3 million years to the year 1783. So that's all older. Oahu, I think there were some minor eruptions later than this, but the main eruptions that formed the island are between 3.3 and 2.3 million years ago. And Kauai was between about 5.6 and 3.8 million years ago. Remember, by the way, if you're curious as to how we get these dates, I'm not going to have time to go into how it's done, but you can use naturally occurring radioactive elements in volcanic rocks, which decay with a known half-life. And so you can measure the amount of radioactive element, the amount of non-radioactive daughter product produced by radioactive decay, and then use a little math to work out the age of the rock. Incidentally, if anybody's curious, if this trend is correct, then the next Hawaiian island ought to appear right about there. And in fact, it is appearing right there. There is a submerged volcano off the coast of the Big Island. It may not break the surface for a few thousand more years. So don't go buying beachfront property on it yet. But it takes a while for these volcanoes to grow because the Pacific is 20,000 feet deep around here. So this one is still, I think, more than a mile below the surface, but it will eventually break the surface and form the next island in the chain. Okay, now we finally get to biology. I think I mentioned that Hawaii was home to a number of really cool species flocks. One of them is the honey creeper birds that we talked about, but it's also home to something like 700 endemic species of fruit fly, genus Drosophila and a related genus called Scaptomyza. Some of these are restricted not just to individual islands, but to individual valleys. Like if you're a fruit fly, flying from a nice, comfortable, warm valley with lots of fruit over a range of hills to the next valley might be more than you can do if you're that small. It's a barrier that you could cross relatively easily with a bit of a hike, but fruit flies can't. So we have not just species that are unique to islands, but unique to very restricted areas of those islands. And the Hawaiian flies are affectionately called picture-winged flies. Those are a bunch of Hawaiian fruit fly wings, and they're all different species, I believe. And you can see they've got all different patterns on them. So by fruit fly standards, these are very attractive flies. Okay, so what? Here's that map again of the order of appearance of the islands. Kauai's the oldest. Oahu is next. These four are next, and the Big Island is the youngest. Well, this was work done about 25 years ago. Um, when they sequenced some DNA from these, it turned out that the earliest branch of one group of these Drosophila species, Drosophila hemispeza, is found on Oahu, which is older, and then the next oldest is found on Molokai, and the next oldest is found on Maui. So the oldest in that group was found here, and then the next oldest was found there, and then the next oldest was found there, and then the youngest were found on the Big Island. So the order of appearance of these taxa mirrors the order of appearance of the islands. And what probably happened, the way that makes sense is, imagine you have, a founding population down here that lives on Oahu. Well, it lives on Oahu, that's fine, it's cool, and some of them become the modern Drosophila hemispeza. And then a new volcano pops up, which would be Molokai, and some of these fruit flies disperse from Oahu to Molokai. Well, okay, they hang out in Molokai, they do their thing, and then Maui forms, and some of those flies disperse to Maui, and they hang out and do their thing and, live their fruit fly lives and eat fruit and do whatever they do. And then the Big Island forms, and they disperse to the Big Island. Right? The order of appearance of the islands mirrors the order of appearance of species, because the species originated on the older islands and dispersed to younger islands as they formed. Probably dispersed, maybe getting blown in a storm or something like that. Maybe drifting across in driftwood or something like that. We may not know exactly how they did it, but they did. This is the results from a much more recent analysis with many more species. And the overwhelming pattern is that speciation has occurred through dispersal from older islands over here to younger islands this way. There have been a few cases of line jumping. There were a couple of cases where a fly lineage in Kauai seems to have bypassed Oahu and made it all the way to Maui. And there's a few cases of backwards jumping. There's one case where an Oahu fly dispersed back to Kauai and evolved into a new species there. So there are some cases of line jumping, and there are some cases of backwards dispersal, but by far the predominant direction has been forwards dispersal, where species evolve on older islands and then populations disperse to newer islands as they form, kind of like walking on a treadmill. Isn't that cool, the way you can put all these together? It turns out that the same is true when we do an analysis of Hawaiian crickets. The oldest branches are on Kauai. The next oldest are on Oahu. So this is the point where some population of Kauai crickets managed to disperse to Oahu and speciate there. And then somewhere around here, the next branch of the family tree seems to have been able to disperse to Maui and to the Big Island, the later islands to form. The story gets a little bit complicated here, but the overall pattern is the same, that you have dispersal from older islands to younger islands in the order that they're forming. The same is true if you do a cladistic analysis of Hawaiian spiders. The oldest branches are the ones on Kauai, slightly younger ones on Oahu, and the youngest of all on the Big Island. And it's even true if you look at plants called silver swords. Very beautiful plants, some of them. The silver sword that's native to Maui is, I think that's Argyroxiphium virescens, is gorgeous. And you get the same thing. The closest relative to all of the silver swords is a California plant called tarweed. And so evidently a few million years ago, some tarweed seeds must have floated across the Pacific and ended up on Kauai. Whoops. They dispersed there, they diversified there, and then some of them made it to Maui when Maui formed. And then a few of them made it to the Big Island once the Big Island formed. So this is how we can take our model of allopatric speciation, put it together with plate tectonics, and get something that makes a great deal of sense. We should all be going, ooh, ah, right now. Okay, so Pangea, the supercontinent, begins rifting apart roughly 200-ish million years ago, and the first split is more or less east-west, with Gondwana down here in the south and Laurasia up here in the north, and a shallow tropical ocean called Tethys that basically girdles the earth. The Caribbean is a remnant of Tethys, so is the Mediterranean Sea, so is the Indian Ocean. They're all remnants of Tethys. Okay, by about 94 million years ago, Gondwana has started rifting apart. Africa is breaking away. India is beginning to break away. Australia and Antarctica are still connected, and there's still a connection between Antarctica and South America down here. Okay, maybe there's an alternate reconstruction of what was going on. So here, Laurasia and Gondwana, Laurasia yells, Red Rover, send India over. And there's Gondwana breaking apart and India moving north to crash into Laurasia and form the Himalayas. Right. Right about that time you saw that map is the time that mammals are diversifying. The oldest mammals are almost as old as the oldest dinosaurs, but all the time that we had dinosaurs up until about 65 million years ago, maybe 64, mammals were generally quite small. They fairly recently found one that was as big as a Cocker Spaniel, but certainly nothing bigger than that has been found. And most of them would have looked like little rats or shrews or mice, even though they technically would not have been. And anyway, 94 million years ago is the tail end of the age of dinosaurs. This is the late Cretaceous, so this is when we have, T-Rex and Triceratops duking it out. Meanwhile, we have little mammals running around, and this is an example of a marsupial. You can tell because of the shape of the pubic bones. It's called Asiatherium, and it looks this nice because it was preserved in a sand dune in Mongolia. So marsupials appear here, but they managed to disperse all the way through Europe to North America, down to South America, and then once they crossed South America, they managed to disperse across Antarctica all the way to Australia. Notice that they missed Africa and India. Here's the thing. They made it to Australia, right? So there's Australia right there. That's where the marsupials are. The placental mammals are, these are the ones you're familiar with, the ones that nourish their young through a placenta. They are as old as marsupials, but the placentals that made it to Australia happened to die out there. So Australia has no native placental mammals except for bats, whales, seals and sea lions, and a small number of rodents that seem to have dispersed there just a few million years ago. And then, of course, species that humans brought, like dingoes and much later rabbits. But yeah, the few placentals that made it to Australia back about, 90 odd million years ago, for whatever reason, they died out there. The marsupials radiated into a bunch of beautiful and crazy forms, like the giant Nagamaroo, that's a jaw from a distant relative to kangaroos, a predatory killer kangaroo called Ecaltodata, and then all of these. Now you know why Darwin was so taken with Australia, because those marsupials in Australia were isolated there. And in isolation, they radiated into all of these wild and diverse species, some of which are hauntingly familiar because they're convergent on placental forms. So Australia has this marsupial mole, the sugar glider instead of a flying squirrel. Numbats are marsupials that have claws and a sticky tongue and eat ants like anteaters. Even marsupial predators like the Tasmanian wolf, which is sadly extinct. Grazing animals like kangaroos. You have this whole mammalian ecosystem that evolved in Australia, isolated from the rest of the world. That's why Darwin was so taken with Australia that he thought that maybe there were two creators, one for the rest of the world and one for Australia. Okay, here we are at the end of the age of the dinosaurs, 66 million years ago. By the way, South Arkansas is right about here. There are some rocks of this age. There actually have been a few dinosaurs found in Arkansas. There's one called Arkansaurus. We don't have a full skeleton of it. We do have a bit of a better record of marine life because Southwest Arkansas was covered by shallow ocean. And we've got some bones of extinct sea critters and lots of shells. And I know some places to go hunting for them. Anyway, so here we are at about 66 million years ago. You can see Gondwana is pretty well broken apart. North America and Europe are starting to move apart. But the mammals that reached South America while there was still this land bridge radiated into some unique forms. So South America has marsupials. There's about 60 marsupials in South America. And there's also placentals in South America. Placentals that died out in South America include big things. South America was kind of like Australia all over again, because the marsupials and the placentals that made it to South America evolved in isolation once South America broke off from Gondwana and became an island, in its own right. So South America has a lot of weird fossil mammals that have not survived to the present day. And these were some things that Darwin found. Some vaguely elephant-like big herbivores called pyrotheres at the top. Notungulates ranged from critters the size of rhinos to critters the size of rabbits. Again, you've got convergent evolution where you have these unique mammal groups that are speciating in South America, isolated from the rest of the world. And some of them are convergent on familiar forms, even though they're not related. This is a South American marsupial. Thylicus smilus is a marsupial. This thing's closest living relative that you'd know would be the possum. But you can see it's got these giant front teeth. It's convergent on saber-toothed cats, but it's not a cat. It's not a placental mammal at all. That saber-tooth form has evolved convergently at least 4 times. I know you know saber-tooth cats because that's Diego in the Ice Age movies, which I know you've all seen because my kid has. But this is not actually a cat. This is basically a possum that's evolved enormous slashing fangs and uses it to rip open the soft underbellies of prey animals. And then I said many of the unique South American mammals have died out, but one major group is still with us. They're called xenarthrans. And xenarthrans includes sloths, anteaters, and armadillos. Now we know why Darwin was so taken with that weird similarity that he kept finding between fossil and living South American mammals. You remember I mentioned South America has living armadillos, and then Darwin was excavating those giant fossil armadillos. South America has living sloths, and Darwin was digging up these giant fossil sloths and noticed that there was this weird similarity between the extinct and the living mammals of South America. Now you know why. When those fossils were forming, South America was a big island. And these xenarthrans radiated into a bunch of forms that stayed on South America because South America was so isolated. So there you've got a screaming hairy armadillo, which I think would be a terrific name for a punk band, like a country punk bands like Hank Williams III. There's an anteater, and that's a marsupial, Brazilian short-tailed possum. About 40 to 45 million years ago, by the way, the ancestors of a group of rodents called the caviomorphs and the ancestors of a group of primates called the platyrrhines managed to disperse to South America, probably from Africa. It's a long way, but the Atlantic was only about a third as wide as it is now. And you can't see them on the map, but there's a few small rocky islands in the middle. So they might have been able to disperse using those as stepping stones. And those dispersed critters gave rise to South America's unique rodents. The most famous South American rodent would be the guinea pig, popular as a pet, as an experimental animal, and in Peru as lunch. The capybara is the world's largest rodent. It's the size of a pig. You can see them in the Little Rock Zoo. The zoo also has, or used to have, maras. That's a rodent that's convergent on rabbits in certain ways. There's a lot more strange South American rodents, and of course, South American monkeys date from this time. So there's an emperor tamarin for you. Tamarins and marmosets. Spider monkeys are the ones where the tail is practically a fifth hand. Those are the ones that are best at hanging and swinging by their tails. Howler monkeys and proboscis monkeys and owl monkeys. Those are descended from ancestors that we think managed to cross the Atlantic 40 to 45 million years ago. Here's the thing, here's 14 million years ago, and things are starting to look pretty familiar. Right here, we're getting subduction along the west coast of North and South America, and that subduction is going to throw up volcanoes, and that is going to build a land bridge between North and South America. That's going to build the Isthmus of Panama. Right there. Now, think about what that does to marine species of here, right? Before the Isthmus of Panama, right, we still had open ocean connecting the North Atlantic and the Pacific. You could have swum from the North Atlantic to the Pacific, and many marine species would have lived on both sides of this isthmus. What do you think happens when we build that isthmus? Well, it starts with a V and it rhymes with vicariance. What you get is the marine life gets split. A result is that if you go shell collecting in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, one of the things that you notice is there's a lot of marine invertebrates on the Pacific side with an uncanny similarity to species on the Caribbean side. Strombus pugilis, the fighting conch. This is native to the Caribbean. Some of you actually used one of these in the, what do you call it? The cladistics lab that you did. Over here on the Pacific coast of Mexico, I've personally picked up Strombus gracilior, which the proportions are a tiny bit different. It's got a higher spire, but in size and shape, it's overall very close to Strombus pugilis. So we have these pairs of species split by the Isthmus of Panama, and the simplest explanation is that gracilior and pugilis used to be one species that maybe lived in all of this area, and then that area got split when the isthmus formed. So we have a great case of vicariance here, and it happens over and over. Purpura patula is the Caribbean rock snail, very similar to Purpura panza, which is the Pacific rock snail. Simplest explanation is that they were isolated because of vicariance. This was done in a little bit more detail in a study on Pacific and Caribbean species of Alpheus, which is known as the pistol shrimp. Pistol shrimps are really cool. That oversized claw right there is actually capable of snapping so fast that it generates vacuum bubbles in the water. The vacuum bubbles implode and create such a powerful shock wave that nearby prey are stunned. So Alpheus just walks up to a worm or a snail or whatever it wants to eat and raises that claw and goes bang and stuns its prey and eats it by creating these vacuum bubbles that generate such powerful shock waves. Very cool critters. Anyway, a few years ago, actually I guess this is getting a little long in the tooth, but I think the conclusions are still sound. They did a cladistic analysis looking at DNA sequences of species of Alpheus on both sides of the isthmus, and I'll colorize this for you. I've done the Pacific species here in a kind of teal and the Caribbean species in a light purple. And you'll notice that the closest relative of each Pacific species is a Caribbean species, right? So Columbiensis is Pacific, Esturensis is Caribbean. Antipenultibus is Pacific, Chasei is Caribbean. Right, so here we have these populations. You know, Cylindricus is apparently considered one species, but the Caribbean ones are distinct from the Pacific ones. There's another, there's another, there's another. We keep getting these pairs, and you're only seeing a part of this. There's about 20 pairs of what we call sibling species, separated only by the Isthmus of Panama. So there was a lot of vicariance affecting the critters in the ocean. On land, it was different because the isthmus created vicariance in the ocean, but it allowed dispersal on land. And it happened in both directions. The possums that live in, hell, they live in my yard. I think they may be in the garage as we speak. They are South American migrants. Armadillos are relatively recent migrants from South America. In fact, they didn't enter the US until about 1850. We don't have sloths anymore, but we used to. They died out about 11,000 years ago, but North American sloths dispersed very slowly from South America, and so did porcupines, which are part of that South American rodent group. And then dispersing north to south, South America got oaks are almost entirely Europe, Asia, North America, but there's at least one species in South America that is a relatively recent dispersal southward. Bears, South American sun bears are, or not sun bears, spectacled bears are descended from an otherwise Laurasian clade. South American cats, like South American cats, you'd know, jaguars, I guess. Coatis, which are related to raccoons, rabbits and skunks, camels, tapirs. All of these are South American mammals that are descended from ancestors that were found in Laurasia and migrated south. And we call this the Great American Interchange. So we get the possums coming north. They get the spectacled bears migrating south. We got the porcupines migrating north. They got the jaguars migrating south. There's a few cases where extinction complicates this pattern. Camels used to be native to North America. This is the fossil skeleton of a camel found in a place called the La Brea Tar Pits in Los Angeles, California. Well worth a visit if you're ever in LA. So we used to have native North American camels. They dispersed south, but then they went extinct in North America about 11,000 years ago, which, as you see, now yields the Llama lineage all alone. Or if you're from Argentina, sheaves the Shama lineage all ashone. Right, sorry about that. But double L turns into a sh in Argentina. Anyway, so that's how South America got its camel relatives, like llamas. They're descended from North American mammals that dispersed south, and then their North American kin died out. North American used to have native horses, and they dispersed to the south, but then for reasons not fully understood, they died out on both continents, and there were no horses on either continent until European explorers introduced Equus caballus, the domesticated horse, which is descended from wild horses that used to be found in Europe and Western Asia. Okay, all right, I know this is going a bit long, but I'm on a roll, and the sooner I finish, the sooner we're done. One last thing I want to document. We talked a little bit about Alfred Russel Wallace, very smart guy, co-discoverer of natural selection, but great scientist in his own right and probably deserves to be better known. And remember, when he came upon the idea of natural selection, he was collecting critters, including beetles, in Indonesia and Malaysia. In this time period, he noticed that there was a sharp boundary in the types of living critters that you found between two islands, the islands of Bali and Lombok. And the boundary is now called Wallace's Line. West of the line, in the islands of Indonesia, you find typically Asian species, Asian birds, mammals, fish, plants. West of the line, that includes tigers and rhinos, pheasants and squirrels, monkeys and orangutans. East of the line, you find birds, mammals, fish, and plants that are much more typical of Australia. You find parrots and cockatoos, megapodes, that's a type of bird affectionately known as the brush turkey, cuscus, a type of marsupial, birds of paradise, you find these east of the line. So as he described it, the islands of Bali and Lombok, though of nearly the same size, of the same soil, aspect, elevation, climate, within sight of each other, differ considerably in their productions and in fact belong to two quite distinct zoological provinces of which they form the extreme limits. So here's a map. There's Wallace's Line. Bali is this island right there. Lombok is this island right there. And they're only 20 miles apart. You know, a very strong swimmer could swim from one to the other, at least in theory. You can see one from the other. You can take a ferry from one to the other. They are, same climate, same type of soil. There's no obvious difference between them. And yet, on the west side of that line, you find things like Asian squirrels, an Asian group of birds called trogons. That's one over there on the right. Tigers, deer, civets, which are little mongoose relatives, rhinos, monkeys, orangutans to the west of the line. To the east of the line, you get this is a cuscus. That's a fruit-eating marsupial. That's a cockatoo, of course. That's an Australian type bird. You get cockatoos. That's a megapode. They're not closely related to turkeys, but they've got a similar kind of wattled head. So they're affectionately known as brush turkeys. There's another marsupial. That's a tree kangaroo. Lots of parrots, birds of paradise. All these things are found to the immediate east of Wallace's line. The inference that we must draw from these facts is undoubtedly that the whole of these islands eastwards beyond Java and Borneo do essentially form a part of a former Australian or Pacific continent, said Wallace. It is interesting to observe among the islands themselves how a shallow sea always intimates a recent land connection. Here's what he meant. There's Wallace's line. Bali, and then this big island, I believe that's Java, and this island whose name I have forgotten, and this one that's Borneo. There's a very shallow ocean between all of these. And when the sea level was lower, this low-lying area of land called the Sunda Shelf, that's now underwater, was above water. And so all of this is, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Singapore is right there, Indonesia and Malaysia here, even up to the Philippines. All of this would have been part of the Asian continent. But Bali is right here. There's Lombok, and there's Borneo with the island of Celebes right there, or Celebes. Celebes makes it sound like, the Kardashians live there. They never were part of the same continent because there happens to be an extremely deep trench between Bali and Lombok. And you can see between Borneo and Celebes, there is no, there was no shallow shelf. It's deep. So between that and the fact that this is all a very active subduction zone, and we have volcanoes blowing up in here on a regular basis, including the really big ones like Krakatau and Tambora, between the volcanoes and the fact that these islands were never connected, dispersal's been blocked through Indonesia. It has not been easy for Australian lineages to disperse this way or for Asian lineages to disperse this way. And where they meet is Wallace's line. And that demonstrates one of the borders between the 8 major biogeographic realms or ecozones. The Nearctic and Neotropic in the Americas, the Palearctic over most of Eurasia, Afrotropic right here. And I might add, by the way, that just as we had the Great American Interchange between South America and North America, there's also been considerable interchange between Africa and the Palearctic zone. Some of the fossils that look like they might be ancestors to African gorillas actually turned up in Greece, for example. So there's been a similar type of interchange as Africa has crashed into Eurasia, throwing up a bunch of earthquakes and volcanoes in here. Indo-Malaya right there, Australasia, and then Antarctic and the islands of the Pacific make up these 8 major realms. And we can put plate tectonics together with our understanding of how speciation happens and work out um, a consistent story that's starting to show us how we got the global biodiversity that we got and why it is where it is and where we find it. And I will now stop the recording.